The world is complicated. We all try to simplify it. This is natural. It is evolutionary. We all try to make sense of the sensory inputs we have as we go through, and so we need to categorize things. The problem is, how do we do it, and what do we lump together? So we're going to shift back again to my topic of a week or two ago. William of Ockham, my favorite medieval philosopher, who is most famous for Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually the best, a fine principle for our time. It's a great antidote for things like conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories rely on all sorts of things that are highly implausible to also be true in order to function. So I don't want to talk about Occam's razor anymore. I want to talk about what I consider to be an even more important principle. I'm looking around here looking for the registration for Shenandoah Park backcountry permit. What I want to talk about, what I consider his most important ideas, are related to species. Now, when you and I and biologists talk about species today, we talk about things that can reproduce themselves and produce viable and fertile offspring. So a horse and a donkey are not the same species. They can produce a mule if you crossbreed them, but a mule is not fertile. So it is considered to be a different kind of species. Species are kind of very strange. I mean, we tend to think of them as like fixed, but they're not. And they're very sort of fluid. So you think of this way: human beings evolved, everything evolved, one generation to the next, and each generation by definition produced viable and fertile offspring for the next generation. But we know that if we went back a long period of time, modern human beings would not be able to reproduce with some of our ancestors who came before us. Similarly, a horse. Horses used to be like the size of poodles, and all modern horses came from parents, grandparents, great-great-grandparents who were of the same species as their offspring, but those ancient precursors of the horse would not be able to reproduce with the current horse. So just keep that in mind, that when we talk about species and the categories, biologic categories in which we put them, it's fluid. It's certainly fluid through time. Oh, look at this. Lovely little spring. I would normally stop and camel up here, but I'm going to be down to my car shortly, and I still have ½ liter in my pack. Okay, back to the thread here. Species. William of Ockham used this term. He wasn't talking about biological species in the term, in the way we think about them, genus and species categorization. He was talking about all things that we bind together. All things logically bind together, not necessarily biologically. And his greatest contribution, I think, was we need to be very careful when we bin things together, because they may fit in a bin one way, but then when we try to stretch that bin or use that bin in a different way or context, when I say bin, I mean, label, category, group, race, everything, things start to break down, and things that were true for one sense are untrue in another sense. And so that was his sort of greatest contribution. In some sense, he also believed that sometimes categories are arbitrary, and they're really nothing more than a name that we give to something. I'm still looking for that kiosk. Something more than a name. So if you were to ask former President Obama what race he is, he might answer, well, I'm black. He might answer, I'm African American. He, uses those two terms regarding himself. And certainly how he identifies, his father was from Africa. But if you were his doctor and he came in and said, hey, I have this ailment, and I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with him, and it turns out there's a genetic thing that afflicts Caucasians, the doctor would say, well, yeah, this you might have this because your mother was Caucasian. So it depends on the category. It depends in the sense of how you're using that category, whether it applies or whether it doesn't apply. And we're lazy. We don't like to think about all the details. We just want to handle the category, not the details. We come to another principle that I'm really believe is true. The categories really don't exist as anything other than a convenience, a shorthand. But what does exist are individuals. And this is especially true when we attempt to categorize people. I'm not sure the category exists or is valid or applies or is correct, depending on the sense in which you want to use it. But I do know that person exists. And I believe all persons, in a legal sense, if you're thinking sort of like about government, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside, and are, under the 14th Amendment, granted equal protection under the law just because they are a person individually. And in my own beliefs, I believe all people are formed in the image of God, no matter what category you might want to bin them or what other attributes they have. And by being formed in the image of God, they are beloved by the Creator. And so, in the words of C.S. Lewis, the holiest thing presented to your senses, other than the Blessed Sacrament, is your neighbor. As an individual, in any category into which that individual, that neighbor may fall, is secondary to their value as a human being and their own personal worth. So that's my musing for today. I'm still trying to find that kiosk. So coming up on Black Rock Summit, sort of one of these very memorable spots, actually on the AT. It's not long, but it's so different than what you typically see. This is a whole massive talus, I guess, more like riprap, that's flowing down the mountain here. It's not long here, but I always remember this little few hundred meters maybe.